Good evening, everyone, from the Catholic University of America. I'm Dr. Daniel Gibbons, and I'm pleased to welcome Andrew Calis to read to us tonight in our the last installment in our fall poetry reading series. Andrew Calis earned his in English literature here at Catholic University, and he's now teaching at Archbishop Spalding High School. We're so glad to have him back tonight to share with us his remarkable poetry. His new book of poetry called Pilgrimages has just come out this year from Resource Publications. And I can't wait to hear him read, and we'll have a brief discussion at the end as well. So please welcome Andrew Calis.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and I'm really excited to be here. It's nice to be back on campus. So I'm going to read a few poems from Pilgrimages. I also have some poems to read as well. I'm excited to share with you also. This first one is one of a series of poems called In Adoration. This first one is called Still Love. The weight of grace sits sternly over all. Fallen man can fall and break on broken ground the boundless imperfections of my being. My failure seeing, my seeing without sight, it makes the shards of life sun glitter, light as a halved bird, clean too. And who am I that God should come to me? The world is dirt made rich, earth terraformed before we knew the term. God so loved and loved form, and all man makes his man-made bread made stale. In prayer, kneeling at the altar, reeling, frail. This next one is called, Where Can I, like Jonah, go? Towards death, but there is God. No way to shut out his shadowed sound, no cloud to hide me, shroud and leave my nakedness, no, it's the deepness of the sea. This next one is called God Seems to Be Unknown. So I used to be, when I was working on my Ph.D, I was an adjunct at a variety of different schools, and I was at Mount St. Mary's, a school I went to as an undergrad, and I really loved there, and sometimes I would be able to make it to daily math and I moved to this poem about pouring because like, I should be paying attention to math, and so I break out my notebook, I wrote out the poem like prayerfully, but after math I felt guilty, so I talked to the priest about it, and I said, is that okay? And he said, well, you really should have been paying attention to math. I know, but then after the fact, a friend of mine who was a seminarian read the poem and said, Andrew, that poem, God seemed to be unknown. You know that there's heresy. I guess it serves me right. And now I'm going to share it with you. God seen, saint of the unknown, at Mass, Mount St. Mary's University. Gilded with large saints above the stone-stern altar, the enclave held a space and hold so unbearably. Christ crucified, arms split apart, a heart wide torn, wide-eyed death, but beyond, alive, somehow, if not now, then some when, already bride. The blue church cave, ocean waves of color curling, curving into deeper than space, waves of holy thought, and Mary, clothed in a different how, a different blue. I cannot love as you, nude on a cross, rough wood aching once again, and which you were when you were. Earth is empty, filled with weight, trapped in a liquid thick loop. Unstable you words the word, makes a speck of bread, you, unstooping, you is and are and was us, made the sea and sky, first light burst forth, life bursting, still bursting through death until the unresting God rests. This next one is also from a chapel, but from a different chapel. The chapel was from Archbishop Spalding. I go there sometimes in the past when life gets too overwhelming. It's called Deus Ex Machina. Life words. Nice clings of clunky conversations heard to the walls of the English office, locked after again. I'm here by obligation, and stuck until the morning when it's unlocked, and school unbarred at 7:32, groans growth with stirring, last year's alibis in this year's shoes, last year's thoughts in this year's minds, like the temple inside a wooden altar dressed in white, the cross, the saints, the tabernacle table, the chairs, the long dead roots that birthed these shouldn't share the smells do. A little lost in times, perhaps. Now they fill the air. Another poem from inside a chapel, also from the same chapel. The weight of solemn silence. The chapel's silence sits as a dutiful animal. It crowds toward the corner, shushing our breath as ice, too heavy for a word, as thick as mourners' clothes. Where are the raging waves you threw to the shore at its birth, where the wild water before Christ came to calm the sea? I can hear you in my path as storms that shook the floor. Where rests the shaking reverence for the ark that kills, the world of wind and breath that recollect as storms do. Apples, I hear the noises pass, the crack of creation. You split the dark into 1,000 things, each shining. Crash of waves on the shore of the sea. The silence calls out for your absent thunder, when once the new world sang a melody that rumbled, full of noise and ancient wonder. Jump ahead a bit. Working all right? Yeah, it says, is this working all right? For those of you online, could you hear this okay? Oh, okay, excellent. I go for it. Okay. So a series of poems in my book, and then after the book are kind of in response to my dad. It's a lot about my relationship with my dad. And my dad is an Arabic immigrant to America, and he sort of shares a lot of the cultural, I guess, I wouldn't say like stereotypes, but he is culturally Arabic, right? Which means he's more reserved in his feelings. It means a lot of different things, right? But one of those things is that he's kind of a hard nut to crack, right? And I love him, and I know he loves me, but like there's a lot in my poem wrestle with trying to know someone that is so close to you, but it's hard to know. So this one's called Jerusalem Heart. My father's scars are large for his mouth, pronouncing words with British emphasis beneath a Palestinian tongue, weighed down by boots soldiers used to bruise his face. It was part of his fault. He antagonized, wouldn't obey curfew. He would play with his band. His rage was unendurable, the soreness of growing pains. Legs feel bent in places bones weren't meant to bend. The age of 20 years spent oppressed, now 40 years behind him, far for aching eyes to make out clearly, a blur of blood, injustice, injury, fear. He couldn't hear so young. The undertones did not hone themselves within his heart. Today, his hands are rough. The work is hard, construction. The loud turf torn by metal teeth, my father silent. I know a handful of his past, 2 decades long as centuries, passed down to morsel portions we share at dinner. I know the names of those he works with. I know the work-started hands. I know he was not 61. How quickly we would leave when dinner ended. How thick our father's decade-hardened walls. I'm going to read, this one is called Arab Men Don't Cry, my father said. On Google Maps, I drink them in. These names that swim in sounds. Ramallah, Al-Zaim, places where real people live. My dad lived there, has felt his history tugging at him like a leash, visited the dead on my screen, a thick blue slug. Nothing lives there, Dad says. The salinity almost 10 times that of the ocean. Years away, I cannot see what he saw. How then do I sense it? Vendors on the street, knafa, fresh and warm, the feces walled in with burning garbage. These things he saw exist somewhere. I'm pulled toward them by sounds I cannot understand. Aman, Gaza, in his voice, the smile he has kept within, surviving in these places, still alive, outliving violence. A 10-minute drive that took 2 hours. The checkpoint guards held him up. Walls of memory come down like rubble, splinter like a broken door. Its eyes freeze with fear. I forget the rest, he says. That was years before I left. But Jericho, Ophrah, Afra, no, he's finished now. Quietly, I let his eyes move elsewhere. The sea receives from the shore. And this next one is called Scorpions. He nears the end. My grandfather. He fell at work, hit his head on a table. I am 8 or 9, too young to know when to cry, and so I watch the adults. My dad can't tell I'm feeling the early tremors. He's trying to quell his own storm. Arab men don't cry, he said before, not when Samir died from a sting, and not now. The smell of almost death fills the bedroom like a crowd. He used to beat my father. My dad refused to hit us. Anger channeled into loud outbursts, a fist through a wall, diffused or redirected, and now he stands rocking, shaking, staring at his hand. Okay, I'm gonna switch gears a little bit. This is another one about school. This is about an event that happened at school recently. Breaking up a fight at school. A fight was in the air before the first fist. When knife-sharp words were flying, we hunted for predators, tooth-bared faces cursing in their heads, their unstained skin stunted. Words and hands were bald and thrown. Our fingers bit their arms, held on, broke the fight up. They growled, refused to own their words, all show, their arrogance, all smoke. Now, 2 kids expelled. Now the room is frozen, dead in an airless quiet. The only sound, the memory of riot, the shadow of a fractured fight, the fog of yesterday, of history's vast call, turning class into a tomb. This one, I wrote a lot of poetry on the metro to and from Catholic University. And this one was written in 2015 so the metro is pretty unreliable. At one point, it actually caught on fire, and it was kind of a tragedy that happened afterward. A number of people were sick, and one person actually died. And in the days that followed, I remember riding the metro, there was a kind of heaviness in the air, right? And so this poem is about how during those days when there's this sort of heaviness in the air, a man with an accordion comes and starts playing this song, and it's like this really beautiful unitive moment, right? And then it's a song that at the end of the poem, a change happened that sort of made me rethink the entire thing. Let's start off with a quote from the Washington Post. One dead, his song, A Second Lost. One dead after smoke fills metro station, forcing evacuation. The metro train exhaled her death like smoke in mourn, as every noise endured for days. For days. The crackling intercom now no more her choke. The metro hardly slows by her grave. Some forget more slowly. A requiem shock when a sad-eyed man's accordion begins to play Dean Martin's sway. Respectfully, no one talks. For her, life, that moving, momentary fade. He nearly smiles once. In solemn praise he sings, instrument and small chest filled with air, and fingers slide and roll and make their way along the keys, an organ and a prayer. Noisily shaking her cup, a peddler girl was there, the actors left together, an abject pair. This next one is also about the metro, and it's up with a quote from Mother Teresa. It's called Warmer Than Wine. Every time you smile at someone, it is an action of love, a gift to that person, a beautiful thing. Mother Teresa of Calcutta. The heart sloshing with the ocean weight of grace, love as sea, love as the blood alive, as unseen cells and unseen veins, where trees leaves that drip rain in baptisms repeated and repeated, impossible to complete as well. The gift of Christ purged love is gift. But the strangers on the train are distances away. The gap of seats, glass eyes, impossible to know in their cold cells. Still, they are not immune to love. Only love has not had them yet, seen them like shimmering glass. How am I doing on time? There's one poem that I was considering reading, but it's very long. I'm doing okay? Okay. This one is called In Blinding Light, and I'm absolutely thrilled to have this one in Dappled Things. Is a journal I was hoping to get in for a long time, and this is a poem that's sort of the first one I had in there. It's a poem I'm very fond of in its own right. It's also about sort of, the challenges of seeing suffering in the surrounding areas. So, In Blinding Light, 1, in Noma. In Noma, God is quieter than cars or car horns. Graves are louder than the deadened voice of God. The sounding city sings of her own death. What voice are engines? What sight outshines the shine of chrome glazed wheels? Light from light is lighting up the rims of wheels. It's brighter than the neon signs or broken bottles. Lighter than the darkened windows or the violent steel that keeps shop windows closed in summer heat. When wind is crying, kneeling at the doors and crying to come in, her voice goes hoarse, she stops. The violent steel that keeps shop windows closed in guard is stern, is left behind, lights changed to green, engines muttering roar. She looked, driver thinks of every girl in sun-blind glass at me. God hides, half whispers, is no match. God rests each morning now. This quiet death would be his only sign. Who can live here? Who can live here? 2 homeless men and one white kicked the shit out of each other. A police car drove blindly by, and a white girl smiled too much, too nonchalant. Walked with her boyfriend, seeing and not seeing the man who pulled at the metaphorical chains. The men who held him back, he demonstrated viciousness, yelled half-heartedly the threats of death, the willingness to go to jail again to kill. It was perfunction. All rage was gone, but there were other homeless men around who saw, knew his practiced hate that was for them, who loved him for the show. 2, blinding light. If the poet can survive, he cannot stay. Each follow is an eye, and it. If he has heard the silent second that is God, he must leave now or drown in staying. Sound that floods the light-bathed city as waves. He'll plod past streetlights, the bright chrome, center stage at every 4-way. He'll shut his eyes. God can blind, he knows. He'll leave. He will leave. His mind will try. The sidewalk there is still stained with its blood. Noma's poet tucks the voice of God in the cradle of his chest. He bows at the beautiful. He bears the blood moons. He enters steel-locked shops and shops. He's seen the face of God in pools, in wind. It carries him like clouds. He trusts what he can hear of God, the whispers, the the broken bottles. He sanctifies the streetlight's staggered glow, though he would never call it sanctity. The houses he has seen from birth and known, the chant of his neighbors lives in him. Do you know who I am? Then look at me. Do you know who I am? Nobody. The next one is called Black Rot. The stifled office air was oyster closed. It rose and weighed as neckstones on our lungs. We complained of students, of the rows of unmarked papers, groaning like the song of Sisyphus, and it was very good. We made of mud a monument of dreariness, maladies of rotted wood manufactured as a sort of beer. Once, Carol made a joke that wasn't even very funny, but at least it breathed its own life, sudden, fresh, and new. At least it wasn't cloud dark that doesn't give of anything but blackness, beast cruel teeth, inborn in brightness. Look, it grew. This next one is about how, as a poet, I'm someone who like loves language and loves words, and as an English teacher, same deal. And this one sort of looks back on the Garden of Eden and considers how man's first responsibility is to name the creatures, one of his first responsibilities. But then the fall, there's slippage in language, and words don't quite mean what they mean. So as a poet, that was like particularly interesting to me. Language and lost. We eat the earth, cursed by man's first fall. We stood once to crawl. We cannot tongue out the sound of leaking life, like man leaked out his duty, his first call, love. Trees named Malum Punicum, named something like sin, are seen unspoken. Spokes of broken life spike through whole foliage. We wear these leaves as skin. We wade through mud. We feel life clawing at our veins, drying like a creature in the sun. A number of the poems also deal with nightmares in that section of the book. This is one of those poems. It's called Losing Sleep. The dreams are mine, where death turns every railway, every plane into cold. There it is sudden, losing whole lives at once. You again. In slow life, how long it takes, it lulls. At night, a firefly lit field faces, each love being one a flash. When we died, it was the plane that sank through air, kept sinking, hit the water, sound stopped, and you stared, eyes wide. Your sea-wet shirt, a weed, now rounder than it was. Love wasn't the only movement, my hand toward yours, I woke gasping and was still. Hid from our own voices, couldn't say, but hinted at the size of death. About me, no. But him, yes, left at that. The scenes are mine, the screaming weight of night. I know them like I know myself in dreams, as fingers slowly toward your hand. There are 4 more that I'll read. This next one is called The Weight of Fire. When I was young, we were on a camping trip in the woods, and my aunt told me not to sit too close to the fire, and I didn't listen, and the spark flew out and caught my favorite pair of red sweatpants on fire. And this is about that experience, but it's told being self-aware, I think, of how stories work. The weight of fire. That fire spark, that Promethean spear of crackling firewood your thigh when you were 5, maybe 10, and camping, blind with pain you left, you screamed and screamed, but wouldn't slide from the scorching skin, widening black, gaping hole of crisp, burned red sweatpants, until your aunt did, and you stood shocked and shaking and naked. You were in shirts and underwear, completely naked, warmed by the stares and humor they all shared, but you were still blinking at that spark that flew from fire. The ash that must have floated up like a lost toward your eye. this next one, it's called The 10 Ways to Read in English Class. It's about trying to teach poetry when sometimes people think poems are something like a puzzle to be solved with the answer, right? It's trying to find the answer to a poem, which is not how it's not how I view poetry. And it's not how I try and teach my students to understand poetry either. The 10 Ways to Read in English Class. Eraser in hand, standing in front of a wave of faces, a sea of students, to say anything is to break that sacred half silence, the moment between what and is. He speaks first, with words as sure as a fist, a finger crushing, wrist shaking handshake, a smile that slams. That poem is, he said, anti-war, and its metaphors are as follows. I couldn't hear what followed. My chest heaved. Cummings, Kraft, next, of course, God, America, I, flattened in the inanity of the internet, pinned and wriggling to a wall of code, stripped of its skin and waved as a flag, ripped from chief all-mind analysis, the first site when you Google, that, of course, God, America, I analysis. It was the worst writ of death. Ah, I thought, poor thing, well, maybe not quite that simple, but hadn't he turned the storm of art to a sharp-cornered seated on a shelf? And he said to the sea, peace, and still, then the wind ceased, dead calm. This was still my classroom. It was still time to write this shit. And so we planted the poem and it grew. Now that poem is months behind us. But I see it prick the back of some students' eyes when we talk about labels, or the many sides a story has, how no two eyes share the same thing, how maybe both stories are wrong and the right story is out there wriggling in some gut. And that's when I see a glimpse of that poem, when I catch them thinking, not quite certain, but just starting to wonder. And this is almost the opposite experience. This is called In Words Already Dead at another lecture. He somehow strives the skyward plane reserved above the world for deep theology, Hegelian swirls in history. He speaks of ages dead before his birth, earth's old days that Lord as distant gone. So well he thinks he knows, he winds in his own reason. His words are born stone still. They stir not even air, withering as weed pulled roots, their smallness unheard, crackling in summer's heavy heat. The for God's large breath, we suffer, clutching their words that long to live. This is the last one. It's called Another Lesson. My son, my 7-year-old, my oldest son is this year, and it's virtual. And earlier today, when I was sort of going over these poems, I was reading this one, and he came in and tried to listen. And I said, no, this isn't for you, right? And he said, why? It's about me. I said, well, some poems are for adults. Some poem is my own poem. It's called Another Lesson. My son's in CCD this year. It's a sonnet. My son's in CCD this year. His teacher is all mine, kind, gentle, young, full of pleasant energy. The meat goes fine. She loses her place 3 times among the piles of handouts that don't match ours. God, there must be some way to transcend this isolation. He's 6. Already hours spent all mine. Can the mind unbend? I can't find the words to offer hope, struggling with my own quiet pain. I ask him what he thought, what he wrote in his journal. He slams it closed, turns away, his eyes shadowed, smiling. Something's there. He mouths some words that could have been a prayer. Thank you. I'll try to answer loudly because my microphone is Was it pretty echoey? Oh, okay. Yeah. I think the most obvious probably Jordan and Hopkins. James not able the kind of my book to something about taking from some of Jordan and Hopkins and using it in my own work. And I think that's definitely um, my love of rhythm and rhyme and playfulness, right? And the language, and definitely the spiritual aspects as well. I think I think it's so hard because like it's impossible ever to compare my work with any of the works I would ever read in the book. But T.S. Eliot is a huge influence. This sort of way that he wrestles with ideas and is willing to be uncertain, right? He similarly with like the idea of negative capability and like being able to not necessarily like solve something, but still keep like having both those ideas in your mind at once. That's definitely been. But Robert Frost, I almost wrote my dissertation on Robert Frost. He's a poet that I love to read. One of the few poets I think for fun I read. I know that sounds horrible, but poetry is not the sort of thing that I often just for fun. But Robert Frost, I will, in blank verse, a lot of my poems are in iambic pentameter, whether or not I mean to, right? That's what I'm just right in. Yeah, I would say those are probably the biggest influences on me. But thank you, that's a great question. Yeah. Yeah. No, that's fantastic. That's not something I would have thought about myself, but it is interesting because I was just saying that so much of my poetry wrestles with like uncertainty and not knowing and like resting in that uncertainty. That was my dissertation topic, right? Like a poet that people thought they solved, and the entire body of work is sort of resisting that idea. So I think that maybe it's like that's the root of both of those loves, right? That my love for not being certain about things influenced both what I like to research and also what I like to write about as a poet. But no, that's a great question and a nice insight that I wouldn't have come to otherwise. All right. Rob, it is great to hear from you. It's interesting. When it started, I really wanted to resist making quarantine art, right? Like, there's a part of me that felt like it would have been superficial. But in the months that followed, right, sort of like being engaged in it for a long, long time, um, some of the poems I've read were about like trying to reach another person, right, trying to like connect to another person, and how much harder it is to do that when I can't read a facial expression, right? When I sort of can't encounter another person as genuinely as I'd like to. And I was actually thinking about something similar yesterday when I was shopping at Giant. My default is to smile at people that I don't know, and I do it, and like there's no way they can know this, right? Like there's almost like, and I'm all for wearing masks, right? I understand the importance of it. I'm not like questioning that, but I think that there's like if it hasn't influenced my focus directly, it's influenced my sense of isolation, and that definitely is influenced some of the poetry I've written. So I didn't go out to write quarantine poetry, but a couple of my poems recently have been more about isolation. But that's an excellent question. Yeah. 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 Um, so I tend to, more often than not, the way I write a poem is I sit down, like as soon as the mood strikes, whether it's on the metro or whether it's in mass or wherever it is, right? Like I feel almost like compelled to get it down on paper because I know myself well enough to know that I forget things very quickly. And I don't, if it's a poem that like I think actually hits, I definitely think that happen. So usually we take out my notebook. I usually have my notebook in my bag with me, and I'll start jotting things down. Um, More often than not, my metro ride was long. It was like close to 45 minutes. And so by the end of it, I would usually have a draft of the poem done, right? Like that Noma poem, the super long one I read, was written on the way home from Noma to my house. So it was like 40 minutes of ride. And I just like went and go. And then afterward, I'll go back and revise parts of it. But yeah, like the first draft is almost on the metro. Sometimes I felt like pretentious because like you've seen people like at Starbucks to break out their work stuff and like I am a novelist writing a novel. I never wanted to be like a poet writing a poem, but like I also didn't care about the stuff as much as I really wanted that poem to have. So that was I was willing to put up with this sort of awkwardness of like scooting away to make sure that people couldn't read what I was writing. And I also have terrible handwriting, so that helps also. This is a source of contention among some of the English teachers in my department. In my honors sophomore class, there's a poetry unit, and every single year I like overjoyed in the month leading up to it and the month following it. And some of my colleagues don't share my same love of poetry, and so they are a little bit less overjoyed than I am. But I do have. It's funny some of the things there isn't as much flexibility with when it comes to curriculum development. Poetry, thank God, is one of those units where it's completely up to the individual teachers to teach whatever we want. So I teach next, of course, God, America, I, and I teach Robert Frost. Which one do I teach? The one that's featured the Macbeth quote. Out, out. I teach out, out. I teach uh, Robert Lowell's the Quaker Graveyard at Nantucket. Some of the poets that like absolutely knocked me out, and that like there's no way my students like I make them read it. And I this is not at all like a pat on my back. It's just that like I think a genuine love for poetry can like actually like occur. I've seen like notes that students have written me, and like a lot of them share a theme, which is I thought I hate poetry. Thank you for making me at least appreciate poetry, like poetry. Now I love poetry. I've had like writing their own poetry after the readings that we've done. Like I just absolutely love it. So I think that joy hopefully translates into something. So I'm very lucky that I have flexibility with the curriculum development. when it comes to poetry. And there's also flexibility elsewhere. If I talk to my co-teachers, I don't even have to talk to them about poetry. I can just do whatever I want in poetry. I can sub it out, and it is a blast every single year to the poetry. Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Um, so I think for me, my poems about faith almost always start from that uncertainty, right? Like I know with faith and I know like I should have this deep commitment, but the truth is like as with everyone, I wrestle with ideas. And one of the places I feel safe to wrestle is poetry, which I think is designed to not give the answer, but like wind your way towards the kind of answer, right? So if I am feeling those moments of like tension or whatever, I tend to go to poetry and write, not with the goal of uh, coming up with an answer, right? But and the goal is sort of like working my way through. And it's funny, you ask in oftentimes if I am writing on a pentameter, sometimes it ends up becoming a kind of sonnet where I do my wrestling in the beginning part, and then I sort of like kind of there's something of a conclusion in the second half, right? How do I do it? I go to the chapel frequently and like bring my poetry with me. Well, bring my poetry with me and like write and think and write and the other time I write, this is gonna sound terrible. Those times I wrote poetry like at a lecture or whatever it is, sometimes it was under the guise of taking notes in the lecture, and it was not taking notes in the lecture. But I felt moved, right? Like I felt like inspired by what was happening in some way to respond to it. So my poetry definitely does that. How to do? I think it's being honest with yourself, right? I don't think poetry would come off nearly as well if it was. How should faith look like as a poem, right? How do you communicate faith in a poem? I think it would come across as inauthentic. And there's something about like not knowing the answer beforehand that I think allows me to be more authentic. So I'm sort of trying to figure it out as I'm playing with those ideas. And also there's sections in my book. The book is called Pilgrimages, and it is like a journey toward faith is one of those pilgrimages. My father is another, the Saturday City is my side. Oh, but there's one point in the book called When the Path is like like the most the deepest periods of doubt or wrestling, struggling with difficulty that I've had. And then the book ends with a single poem called Pilgrimage to Sunset, which is like I wander, Lord, I feel it, but lead me back to you, right? Essentially. So it tries to acknowledge that faith is not easy, easily applicable thing. It's a thing that I think takes a lot of difficulty to come to. Thank you so much for having me here.
Yeah, thank you.